Dreams, Evolution, and Value Fulfillment by Jane Roberts, Volume 2, a Seth book. So this is Part 7 in Chapter 8. And I will be reading 2 sessions in this video again. Okay, so Seth states, "Now, remember that these units of consciousness of which I have been speaking are not neutral, mathematical, or mechanistic. They are the smallest imaginable packages, in quotes, of consciousness that you can imagine. And despite any ideas to the contrary, basically, consciousness has nothing to do with size. If that were the case, it would take more than a world-sized globe to contain the consciousness of simply one cell. So, your physical life is the result of a spectacular, spontaneous order. The order of the body spontaneously formed by the units of consciousness. Your experience of the world is largely determined by your imaginations and your reasoning abilities. These did not develop through time as per usual evolutionary beliefs. Both imagination and reason belonged to the same species from the beginning. But the species has used these qualities in different ways throughout what you think of as historic time. There is great leeway in that direction so that the two can be combined in many, many alternate fashions, each particular combination giving you its own unique picture of reality and determining your experience in the world. Your many civilizations, historically speaking, each with its own fields of activity, its own sciences, religions, politics, and art, these all represent various ways that man has used imagination and reason to form a framework through which a more or less cohesive reality is experienced. Man, then, has sometimes stressed the power of the imagination and let its great dramatic light illuminate the physical events about him, so that they were largely seen through its cast. Exterior events in those circumstances become magnets, attracting the dramatic force of the imagination. Inner events are stressed over exterior ones. The objects of the world then become important not only for what they are, but because of their standing in an inner world of meaning. In such cases, of course, it becomes quite possible to go so far in that direction that the events of nature almost seem to disappear amid the weight of their symbolic content. In recent times, the trend has been in the opposite direction, so that the abilities of the imagination were considered highly suspect, while exterior events were considered the only aspects of reality. You ended up with a true or false kind of world, in which it seemed that the answers to the deepest questions about life could be answered quite correctly and adequately by some multiple choice test. Man's imagination seemed then to be allied with falsehood, unless its products could be turned to advantage in the materialistic experience. In that context, the imagination was tolerated at all only because it sometimes offered new technological inventions. I have taken 2 contrasting examples of the many ways in which the powers of the imagination and those of the reasoning abilities can be used. There are endless varieties, however, each subjectively and genetically possible, and many, of course, that you have not yet developed as a species. Rupert or Jane today received a letter from a man who would certainly be labeled a schizophrenic. Rupert was distressed not only by the individual situation, but by the philosophic implications. Why on earth, he thought, should someone form such a reality? He's referring to Rupert. Now, on the question of, quote, mental disorders, it is highly important that the individual integrity be stressed rather than the blanket definitions that are usually accorded to any group of symptoms. In many such circumstances, however, such individuals are combining the imagination and the reasoning abilities in ways that are not in keeping with their historic periods. It would not be entirely out of keeping, though somewhat exaggerated a statement, to claim that men who stockpile nuclear weapons in order to preserve peace are insane. In your society, such activities are, in a way that completely escapes me, somehow under the label of humanitarianism. Such plans are not considered insane ones, though in the deepest meaning of that word, they are indeed. There are many reasons for such actions, but an overemphasis upon what you think of as the reasoning abilities, as opposed to what you think of as the imaginative abilities, is at least partially to blame. In the case of the man who wrote Rupert, we have a mixture of those characteristics in which interior events, the events of the imagination, cast too strong a light upon physical events as far as the socially accepted blend is concerned. Again, I am not speaking about all cases of mental disorder here. I do, however, want to make the point that your prized psychological norm as a species means that you must also be allowed a great leeway in the use of the imagination and the intellect. Otherwise, you could become locked into a rigid, conscious stance, one in which both the imagination and the intellect could advance no further. It is vitally important that you realize the great psychological diversity that is present within your psychological behavior. And those varieties of psychological experience are necessary. They give you vital psychological feedback, and they exercise the reaches of your abilities in ways that are overall most advantageous. The man who wrote wants to live largely in his own world. He hurts no one. He supports himself a good deal of the time. His view of reality is eccentric from most viewpoints. He adds a flavor to the world that would be missing otherwise. And through his very eccentricity, to some extent, he shows other people that their rigid views of reality may indeed have chinks in them here and there. I do not mean to idealize him either or others of his kind, but to point out that you can use your imaginations and intellect in other fashions than you do. In fact, such fashions are not only genetically possible, but genetically probable, a matter I will discuss later in the book. The imagination, of course, deals with the implied universe, those vast areas of reality that are not physically manifest, while reason usually deals with the evidence of the world that is before it. That statement is generally true, but specifically, of course, any act of the imagination involves reasoning, and any act of reason involves the imagination. Now, there are sometimes almost insurmountable difficulties involved on my part in trying to explain the origin of your world. You think of your universe as having certain dimensions, and you want an explanation based more or less upon the proposition that those dimensions themselves made possible the origin, which must, however, have emerged from other larger dimensions of actuality than those contained in your universe itself. The terms of reality within your universe cannot hold or contain that vaster context in which such master events happen. Therefore, I must follow to some extent the traditional references that you use to define events to begin with. While I am doing that, I am also trying to introduce you, intuitively at least, to a larger framework in which events straddle the reality that you know. Nevertheless, we will begin with issues in which it is very possible that contradictions may seem to occur, since your own definitions of events are so simple that they ignore larger ramifications that would reconcile any seeming contradictions in any overall greater unity of structure and action. Your imaginations will be of high value here, for they can often perceive unities that are not evident to the intellect, which you have trained to deal specifically with the evidence of the here and now. There are phases of relatedness, rhythms and harmonies of consciousness, from whose infinite swells the molecular, quote, music of your universe is sounded. Your place in those rhythms is highly vital. You exist in a kind of original interval, though, if you can, think of the word, quote, interval without the connotations of continuing time. It is as if an infinite number of orchestras were playing simultaneously, and each note sounded was also played in all of its probable positions with each other note possible, and in combination with all of the probable versions of the entire piece being played. Between the notes sounded, there would be intervals, and those unsounded intervals would also be part of a massive, unstated rhythm upon which the development of the entire sounded production was dependent. The unsounded intervals would also be events, of course, cues for action, triggers for response. Your stated universe emerged out of that kind of interval, emerging from a master event whose true nature remains uncaptured by your definitions. So there will be places in our book where I may say that an event known to you is true and untrue at the same time, or that it is both myth and fact. And in so doing, I hope to lead you towards some psychic comprehensions of a kind of event far too large for your usual categories of true and false. Perhaps, then, you will let your imaginations play upon the usual events of your world, and glimpse at least in part that greater brilliance that illuminates them, so that it leads you intuitively to a feeling for the source of events and the source of your world. The units of consciousness that I have mentioned are that, and they do behave as I've said. They are also, in other terms, entities, fragments of all that is, if you prefer. Divine fragments of power and majesty, containing all of the powers of consciousness as you think of it, concentrations without substance in your terms. There are many other universes besides your own, each following its own intervals, its own harmony. Your ideas of historic time impede my explanations. In those terms, your world's reality stretches back far further than you imagine. And in those terms, you need the qualifications. Your ancestors have visited other stars as your planet has been visited by others. Some such encounters intersect in space and time, but some did not. There are endless versions of life. There are then other species like your own, and in the vast spectrum of existence that your reality cannot contain, there have been galactic civilizations that came together when the conditions were right. Time's framework does not exist as you think it does. Intervals of existence are obviously not the same. In ways impossible to explain, there are what I can only call inner passageways throughout the universe. You know how one association can suddenly, in your minds, connect you with a past event so clearly that it almost seems to occur in the present. And indeed, a strong enough memory is like a ghost event. So there are processes that work like associations that can provide passageways through the universe's otherwise time-structured ways. These passageways are simply a part of the greater nature of events that you do not perceive. At times, your species has traveled those passageways, and many of your myths represent ghost memories of those events. There is a rhythm, again, to all existence, and so, in your terms, your species returned to its home planet to renew its roots, refresh its natural stock, to return to nature, to find solace again amid the sweet ancient heritage of dusk and dawn. The planet has seen many changes. It has appeared and disappeared many times. It flickers off and on. But because of those intervals of your attention, each quote on period seems to last for millions of years, of course, while at other levels the earth is like a firefly, flickering off and on. I do not mean by such a description to minimize the importance of physical life, for all that is endows each portion of its own transformed reality with a unique existence that is duplicated nowhere else, and each spark of consciousness is endowed with a divine heritage that is never extinguished, a spark that is apparent in all other corners of the universe. Wow, right? That was an awesome freaking session. Session notes number 2, if you're interested in pausing and reading, here it is. It's Rob's notes, kind of interesting. He makes reference to the mathematical ideas that Seth was referring to, and so you can read that if you want to. And there's the next page. Pause. Chapter 9 on master events and reality overlays.